I'm tired, I just want to die and forget all these. Why me? Why my father? What do I do? Who do I run to? Naomi sat in her dimly lit room, the faint glow of a kerosene lamp casting ghostly shadows on the walls. Her tears soaked into the threadbare pillow beneath her, her sobs muffled by the ragged quilt she clutched tightly. The air was thick with the metallic scent of her blood, a scent that always signaled the onset of her nightmare. It was the first day of her monthly flow. Outside her window, the village of Agba bustled in preparation for the coronation ceremony that would crown her father, Baba Femi, as king. The villagers sang songs of joy, their voices rising in a cacophony of praise for the man they believed was their savior, their leader, their hope. Naomi knew better. To her, he was nothing but a monster in a father's skin. Her father had once been her hero, a man who carried her on his shoulders and told her stories about brave warriors and wise kings. But that was before the darkness crept into their lives, before he became a man consumed by ambition and greed. She remembered the first time it happened, the way he'd avoided her gaze afterward, muttering hollow promises that it was for the good of the family. Naomi shivered at the memory, her fingers tracing the scars on her wrist she had tried to hide. She had attempted to escape the pain once, but the thought of her mother and brothers stopped her. They were her only anchors in this storm of despair, even though they had no idea of the horrors she endured. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on her door. Naomi. It was Tunde, her younger brother. His voice was laced with concern. I'm fine, she lied, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. You've been in there all day. Mama says to come and eat, Tunde pressed. I'll be out soon, Naomi replied, wiping her tears quickly. Tunde lingered for a moment before retreating. Naomi knew she couldn't keep this secret forever. The weight of it threatened to crush her, but fear of her father's wrath kept her silent. She needed a way out, but how could she fight a man who held the entire village in the palm of his hand? As the night deepened, Naomi stared at the ceiling, her mind churning. She would not let this continue. She would find a way to end this nightmare, even if it meant risking everything. Naomi's resolve grew stronger the following day as she wandered the village. The active market was alive with the scents of fried akara, smoked fish, and the earthy aroma of freshly harvested yams. Women gossiped under the shade of large mango trees, their laughter masking the weight of her secret. Outside her door, the voices of her mother and brothers floated through the air like a distant dream. Tunde was laughing about something Femi had said. Naomi envied their carefree lives. They had no idea about the darkness that clouded her world. One night, as she stared out her window at the full moon, she saw Baba Ayo standing in the distance. He was talking with her father, gesturing toward the sky. She couldn't make out the words, but her father nodded solemnly. Her skin crawled. What was this man to her father, and why did he seem to have such a hold over him? The next day, Naomi ventured into the village, hoping for some semblance of normalcy. The vibrant colors of the market and the cheerful chatter of the women seemed like a different world. But then she spotted Baba Ayo again, leaning against a mango tree, his gaze fixed on her. He smiled a chilling, knowing smile. Naomi froze. Was he watching her? Did he know? She turned quickly and fled, her heart pounding in her chest. Naomi began noticing patterns. Every month, on the first day of her flow, Baba Ayo would visit her father. Their meetings were always secretive, their words too low to hear. But one evening, she dared to listen. Hiding behind the kitchen wall, she strained to catch their conversation. The coronation is in 3 days, Baba Ayo said. If you falter now, everything we've worked for will crumble. I've done everything you've asked, her father replied. His voice wavered, a hint of fear breaking through his usual sternness. Not everything, Baba Ayo said coldly. The shrine demands total obedience. You know the cost of failure. Naomi's stomach churned. What were they talking about? What had her father failed to do? Naomi waited until the house was still. The faint crackling of the oil lamp in the living room was the only sound, accompanied by her brother's quiet snores. Her mother had gone to bed early, her usual exhaustion from the day's work dragging her under. Naomi crept barefoot across the dusty floor, her heart hammering in her chest. Her father's study, a place she had never dared to enter, loomed like a dark secret at the edge of the house. The door creaked as she pushed it open. The room smelled of earth, old paper, and something faintly metallic. Moonlight filtered through the small window, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Her gaze fell on the wooden chest in the corner. Swallowing her fear, Naomi knelt and lifted the lid. Her fingers brushed over old farming tools and crumpled pieces of paper until they landed on something strange, a small leather-bound journal. As she flipped through the pages, her breath hitched. The words were cryptic yet horrifying. Blood for vitality. The first day ensures strength. A father's sacrifice. Her hands began to tremble. She was about to turn to another page when a sharp sound pierced the silence. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, heading straight for the study. Panic surged through her. She scrambled to close the chest, her movements frantic. The journal slipped from her hand and fell to the floor with a muffled thud. The footsteps grew louder. With no time to spare, Naomi slipped out through the study's back door, her bare feet making no sound against the earth. She crouched low behind a cluster of plantain leaves, her heart pounding as the study door creaked open. Through a gap in the leaves, she saw her father step inside. Barber Femi's figure was shadowed, but his movements were sharp and purposeful. He looked around, his hand reaching for something on the table. A chewing stick. Then he paused. His eyes swept the room. "Who's been in here?" he muttered, his voice low but dangerous. Naomi held her breath. Her father moved toward the chest. She bit down on her lip to stop a gasp as he opened it. For a moment, he simply stared. Then, shaking his head, he muttered, "Rodents." He closed the chest and left, taking his chewing stick with him. Naomi remained frozen behind the plantain leaves until she was sure the house was quiet again. Only then did she slip back into her room, her mind racing. She hadn't gotten much, but she had seen enough to know there was something her father was hiding, and it was tied to her suffering. The next morning, Naomi's mind was a storm of questions. What was in that journal? What did the words mean? Why was her father acting like a man carrying a heavy burden? Determined to find out, she waited until Barber Femi left the house for his usual rounds in the village. This time, she was more cautious. She returned to the study, her heart racing as she carefully reopened the chest. The journal was still there, undisturbed. Her hands trembled as she turned the pages. This time, she read more. The Ita shrine must be honored. Youth comes at a price. The blood of the pure ensures the pact remains unbroken. Her throat tightened. It didn't make complete sense, but the pieces were beginning to fit together. The horrifying reality dawned on her. Her father had traded her innocence for power. She found another entry, written in a hurried scrawl. Baba Io says she must not resist. The shrine will punish failure. Naomi felt bile rise in her throat. Before she could read further, a creak outside the study made her freeze. Her hands quickly returned the journal to its place, and she backed away. The door swung open, and Tunde poked his head in. "Naomi," he asked, frowning. "What are you doing in here?" "Nothing," she lied, forcing a smile. "I was just looking for something." Tunde shrugged, unconcerned. "Mama's calling you. She needs help with the cassava." Naomi nodded, slipping past him, her mind spinning. She needed to talk to someone, anyone, but who? The sun filtered through the thatched roof of their kitchen hut the next morning, casting long shadows on the table where Naomi's family gathered for breakfast. The aroma of yam porridge mixed with the earthy smell of the clay walls, but Naomi couldn't bring herself to eat. Every scrape of a wooden spoon against a calabash made her flinch. Her father sat at the head of the table, his booming laugh filling the room as he regaled her brothers with stories from his youth. Her mother smiled, doting as always, brushing crumbs off his agbada with a tenderness that made Naomi's stomach churn. How could he sit there so calmly, as though he weren't a monster? How could his hands, so warm and steady, hide the sins they'd committed against her? She dropped her gaze to her plate, her appetite long gone. Naomi's brothers, Femi and Tunde, joked about wrestling matches and their father's strength. Baba could still wrestle the strongest man in the village, Tunde declared, his grin wide. Yes, Femi agreed, a hint of pride in his voice. He's the reason we're respected. Naomi clenched her fists under the table, her nails digging into her palms. Her brothers saw a hero. Her mother saw a devoted husband. Only she saw the truth, a truth too heavy for her 16-year-old heart to bear. Her silence was suffocating. She couldn't confide in her mother. The woman's loyalty to Baba Femi was unwavering. And her brothers? They idolized their father. She felt trapped, like a bird in a cage with no escape. But she couldn't carry the burden alone anymore. The midday sun was harsh, beating down on the dusty paths of the village as Naomi made her way to Ada's home. The herbalist's hut sat at the edge of the forest, surrounded by a garden of medicinal plants that buzzed with life. Naomi had always loved the smell of Ada's home, a mix of fresh herbs and wood smoke that felt comforting, like a warm embrace. Ada was crouched outside, pounding leaves in a wooden mortar. Her face lit up when she saw Naomi. "Naomi, you look like you've seen a ghost," she said, brushing her hands on her wrapper as she stood. Naomi hesitated, her throat tightening. Ada had been her closest friend since they were children, but could she truly share the weight of what had happened? The two girls had been inseparable growing up, their laughter echoing through the village as they climbed mango trees and raced along the riverbank. While Naomi was quiet and cautious, Ada was her opposite, bold and fearless, always the first to jump into the deep end of the stream or argue with the boys who teased them. Ada was the one who had taught Naomi how to swim, how to catch fireflies at night, how to make bracelets from palm fronds. But as they grew older, their lives had taken different paths. Ada's days were now spent helping her mother gather herbs and prepare remedies, while Naomi spent hers under the watchful eye of her family. Still, the bond between them had remained unshaken. Now, standing before Ada, Naomi felt a lump in her throat. If anyone could understand, it was her. "Ada," Naomi began, her voice trembling. "I need to talk to you. But you have to promise you won't tell anyone. Not even your mother." Ada's playful expression vanished, replaced by concern. She led Naomi into the hut, where the air was cool and fragrant with the scent of drying leaves. "You're scaring me, Naomi. What's wrong?" Naomi hesitated, her hands twisting in her lap. Then, in a rush, the words spilled out. She told Ada everything, her father's unspeakable actions, the warning to keep silent, the fear that consumed her every waking moment. Ada listened without interrupting, her eyes wide with shock. When Naomi finished, there was a long silence. "Your father did what?" Ada finally whispered, her voice sharp with fury. Naomi nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know what to do, Ada. If I tell anyone, he'll destroy us." Ada stood abruptly, pacing the small space. This is evil, Naomi. He's not just your father, he's supposed to protect you." Naomi buried her face in her hands. "But he's also my family. If I speak out, it'll ruin everything. My mother, my brothers, they don't know. They'll hate me. Ada knelt beside her, gripping her shoulders. Listen to me. You've done nothing wrong. Nothing. This is on him, not you. We'll figure this out together. Naomi looked up at her, hope flickering in her tear-filled eyes. What can we do? He's too powerful, Ada. He's about to become king. Ada's jaw tightened. Power doesn't make him untouchable. We'll find a way to stop him. Over the next few days, the girls met in secret, their heads bent together as they whispered in the shadows. Ada's mind was as sharp as her tongue, and she began piecing together a plan. We need evidence, Ada said one evening as they sat by the river. Something that proves what is done. Without it, no one will believe us. Naomi thought of the journal she had found in her father's study. There's something, a book. I saw it in his study. It has strange writings about blood and sacrifices. I didn't understand all of it, but it felt important. Ada's eyes gleamed with determination. Then we'll get it. Tonight. Naomi's stomach churned at the thought of returning to the study, but she nodded. She couldn't let her fear control her anymore. That night, as the village settled into sleep, the two girls crept through the shadows, their bare feet silent on the dirt paths. The air was thick with tension, every creak of the bamboo fences making Naomi's heart race. When they reached the study, Naomi hesitated. What if he catches us? Ada squeezed her hand. Then we run. But we have to try. The door creaked as they pushed it open. The room was dark, the only light coming from the moon outside. Naomi led Ada to the chest, her hands shaking as she lifted the lid. The journal was there, just as she had left it. She handed it to Ada, who flipped through the pages with a frown. This is it, Ada whispered. This is what we need. Before they could leave, a sound froze them in place, a faint creak, like a footstep outside the door. Someone's coming, Naomi whispered, her voice barely audible. Ada grabbed her hand. We go out the back. Now. They slipped out into the night, their hearts pounding as they ran through the village, clutching the journal like a lifeline. Naomi didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in months, she felt a flicker of hope. She wasn't alone anymore. Ada sat on her bed, her eyes scanning the journal. The pages were filled with scribbled notes, but the meaning behind the words still eluded her. She ran her fingers over the ink, trying to make sense of it all. But then her thoughts drifted to Naomi's words from their previous conversation. Something had bothered her about the pattern, something that didn't sit right. She stared at the journal for a moment before her eyes widened with a sudden realization. Wait, she muttered to herself. Why is it always on Naomi's first day of her menstrual flow? Ada frowned, her mind whirring. Why is it only that day? Why not any other day? She felt the knot in her stomach tighten as the question echoed in her head. She immediately picked up her pen and sent a message to Naomi. Hey, I've been thinking. Why do you think this thing always happens on the first day of your flow? Could it be connected to something more? Minutes later, Naomi replied, her message arriving with a tone of curiosity and confusion. That's what I've been wondering too. It just doesn't make sense, does it? A chill ran down Ada's spine as she realized that the more she thought about it, the less it seemed like a coincidence. What if? She began typing, her fingers hovering over the keys. What if you came to stay with me at my house during your next flow? Maybe we could test something, see if the pattern holds true. She further writes, holding her breath for Naomi's response. It wasn't like Ada to entertain such strange ideas, but something inside her was driving her forward. Naomi's reply came quickly, though it was filled with doubt. You want me to stay at your house? Have you forgotten about my father? He can literally calculate the exact day of my next flow. He doesn't miss a beat. He's always been, well, protective. Ada chuckled softly, imagining Naomi's father, a man who could seemingly predict everything in his daughter's life, down to the day of her menstrual cycle. But Ada was determined, her mind made up. You think your father is the only one with precision? Ada teased as she writes, her tone playful. Let's just try it. What's the worst that could happen? Naomi hesitated, her pen dancing across her mouth. You're serious about this, huh? Naomi visited Ada the next day, to know how serious she was. Yes. I have a feeling this could be more than just coincidence. We need to figure this out. If it's real, then it could mean something big, Naomi. Naomi sighed, her uncertainty palpable. All right, fine. I'll stay with you. But if my father catches wind of this... Ada laughed aloud, bidding her farewell as they ended their conversation. Naomi returned home. And with that, they made a plan. Naomi would come to stay with Ada at her house during the next cycle, and together, they would investigate further. But deep down, Ada couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the brink of uncovering something they weren't prepared for. What was the connection? Why the first day? Why Naomi? There were far too many questions, and Ada knew that this wasn't just about a strange coincidence. It was something deeper. Something hidden beneath the surface that both of them were about to uncover whether they were ready or not. The next month came swiftly, and with it, Naomi's dread. The first day of her flow had become a symbol of terror, a reminder of the nightmare she couldn't escape. But this time, Naomi was ready. She had made a plan, albeit a dangerous one, with Ada by her side. Stay with me, Naomi, Ada had urged, her eyes fierce with determination. This time, we'll keep you safe. Your father won't dare look for you here, and I have a plan to make him think you're still at home. The plan was simple, but risky. Naomi would stay with Ada for the next few days, hidden away in the comfort of the herbalist's hut, while Ada would ensure everything at home seemed normal. They would leave just enough signs of Naomi's presence to fool Barber Femi, but not enough to raise suspicion. Ada had even gone so far as to suggest that Naomi pretend to be ill, to explain her absence from the house without anyone raising an eyebrow. On the morning of the first day of Naomi's flow, the village of Agba was alive with activity as usual. The sun rose slowly, painting the sky in hues of gold and pink, casting a glow over the lush village that seemed oblivious to the dark secrets hidden beneath its surface. Naomi, dressed in Ada's spare clothes, slipped quietly out of her family's home before dawn. Ada was already waiting, her small hut in the outskirts of the village welcoming Naomi like a sanctuary. The smell of freshly cut herbs and the warmth from a simmering pot of tea gave Naomi a sense of peace she hadn't known in months. But while Naomi settled into the temporary safety of Ada's home, her father, Barber Femi, was beginning to notice her absence. The first sign came when he entered the kitchen for his morning tea, expecting Naomi to be there, as usual, preparing the family's meal. But the kitchen was eerily silent. His eyes scanned the room, noting the absence of the familiar sound of her stirring the pot, her quiet presence that always filled the space. Naomi. Barber Femi called, his voice sharp and demanding. There was no response. He called again, his voice growing more agitated. Naomi. His frustration was immediate. With a few angry strides, he crossed the room and peered into the small adjoining rooms, her bedroom, the storeroom, even the latrine, but Naomi was nowhere to be found. His pulse quickened, his brow furrowing as a surge of rage began to stir within him. Where is that girl? He muttered under his breath. He felt the familiar cold knot of fury tighten in his chest. It was too early in the morning for this kind of trouble. She better not be out in the village with those useless girls again. Femi was quick to dismiss the possibility of her leaving the house voluntarily. After all, his daughter knew better than to disobey him. She was supposed to stay in the house today. But as the minutes ticked by and Naomi's absence became more apparent, his anger turned into something darker: fear, suspicion, and a gnawing sense of betrayal. He stormed through the house, banging open doors, flipping aside curtains, checking every corner. Finally, his gaze fell upon Naomi's bed. The thin blanket lay undisturbed, the pillow perfectly fluffed. Her absence was so absolute, it felt like a slap in the face. He stormed outside. Tunde, he barked, and his younger son came running with wide eyes. Yes, Baba. Where is your sister? Tunde looked momentarily confused, his face still half asleep. Naomi? She's not here? I thought she was in the kitchen. Baba Femi's face twisted with fury. You thought she was in the kitchen? You should have known where she was. Go search for her. Now. Tunde, frightened by the rare fury in his father's voice, dashed out to search for Naomi, calling her name along the way. Baba Femi stood in the courtyard, hands clenched into fists. His mind raced, calculating the possibilities. Naomi had never defied him like this before. The way she had suddenly disappeared was no accident. A strange thought began to creep into his mind, one he didn't want to acknowledge. Had she run away? No, that couldn't be. She wasn't capable of such betrayal. But the gnawing sense of unease only grew stronger as the minutes passed, his pulse beating louder in his ears. At the same time, Ada and Naomi were not far from the village, hidden in the safety of the herbalist's hut. Ada sat calmly by the small cooking fire, preparing tea, while Naomi tried her best to settle into the peaceful surroundings, but her nerves were shot. Every sound, the creak of the bamboo hut, the rustle of leaves, made her jump. He's going to find out eventually, Naomi whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Ada smiled, reassuring her. Not today. You're safe. Now focus. I've got everything under control. But even as Ada spoke, she couldn't shake the feeling of tension in the air. The plan was unfolding too smoothly. She knew Baba Femi would eventually come looking for Naomi, and when he did, they needed to be prepared. Back in the village, Baba Femi's anger had reached a boiling point. He had scoured the village, even storming the market square, demanding that the villagers keep an eye out for Naomi. By midday, he was beside himself with rage. I'll deal with that girl, he muttered, pacing back and forth. His thoughts were clouded with a sense of control slipping away from him. He couldn't understand why Naomi would pull such a stunt. She had never disobeyed him before. Then, a messenger arrived from the village elders. Baba Femi, the young man said cautiously, the elders request your presence. There is a matter of great importance to discuss regarding the coronation. Baba Femi's response was swift, his face hardening. This can't wait. My daughter is missing, and I will find her. The coronation can wait. But the messenger persisted, his tone respectful but firm. Baba Femi, the elders say the coronation must proceed without delay. We have waited years for this moment. The village will not be put in jeopardy. Baba Femi's fury was palpable, but he knew better than to risk angering the elders, especially at such a critical time. He had ambitions that reached far beyond the village, and this coronation was the key to everything. Reluctantly, he nodded. Very well. But I will not rest until Naomi is found. As Baba Femi begrudgingly made his way to the elders' gathering, his mind raced. Where could Naomi be? And why had she not returned home? In the shadows of Ada's hut, Naomi's heart raced as she listened to the distant sounds of the village. Her father was furious, and she knew it wouldn't be long before his wrath reached its peak. Ada's hand rested gently on Naomi's arm. This is just the beginning. We'll be ready for whatever comes next. Naomi nodded, her breath shaky. She had no choice but to trust her friend. They were in this together, and together, they would face whatever Baba Femi had in store for them. But little did they know, Baba Femi's search for Naomi was far from over. And the deeper he dug into her disappearance, the closer he would come to uncovering the terrifying truths they both hoped would remain hidden forever. The tension in the village was suffocating after Naomi's disappearance. No one could have predicted the consequences that would follow her rebellion, least of all, Ada. Baba Femi returned to their home, his expression a dark cloud of rage. He had searched the village high and low, had interrogated every person he could find, and yet he had been unable to locate Naomi. That was until one of his trusted men told him that they had seen glimpse Naomi in Ada's house earlier that day. Naomi had gone out to ease herself. The compound had no fence, so one can easily see through and monitor everyone's movement. That was when the passerby had seen Naomi and had reported to their father. His heart raced with anger as he marched to Ada's house, fury clouding his every step. The villagers, sensing the storm brewing, watched from their doorways with bated breath. Ada had already prepared herself for what was coming. She had spent hours wrestling with guilt, knowing full well what Baba Femi was capable of. She had been Naomi's protector, but the truth was undeniable. She had hidden Naomi from the wrath of a man who saw no crime in brutal punishment. When Baba Femi finally arrived, his voice boomed in the small, humble hut. "Ada," he shouted, his words dripping with venom. "You dare shelter my daughter? Do you think I wouldn't find out?" Ada, her heart hammering in her chest, stood in the doorway, trembling. She had seen this side of Baba Femi before, the side that was capable of anything. His rage had no boundaries. "I didn't force her to stay, Baba Femi. She was afraid, and I protected her as any friend would," Ada tried to explain, though she knew it was futile. The moment the words left her mouth, Baba Femi's anger erupted like a volcano. His hand shot out, grabbing Ada by the wrist and pulling her towards him with an iron grip. "You'll pay the price," he shouted. Ada winced from the pressure of his grip, but her mind was too numb with shock to protest. The slap came hard and fast. A sharp sting to her face made Ada stumble backward, her vision blurred for a moment. She felt a hot, burning tear slide down her cheek, but she barely noticed. She was too overwhelmed by the fury in Baba Femi's eyes. Naomi, who had been hiding behind a curtain, witnessed it all. Her heart shattered as she saw her only friend, her lifeline, beaten before her eyes. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. All she knew was that Ada, who had done nothing but help her, was suffering because of her. In the chaos that followed, Baba Femi raged further at Ada. "You think you can protect her? You will never see her again," he shouted at Ada, pushing her roughly aside. Naomi couldn't stand it no longer. She rushed to Ada's side, attempting to shield her from further harm, but Baba Femi, furious beyond reason, simply shoved her away, hitting her hardly. His eyes, once full of fatherly love, now glowed with pure hatred. "You've made your choice, Ada. You've chosen to stand by this disrespectful girl, and I will make sure both of you suffer," Baba Femi spat, his voice cold as ice. Baba Femi dragged Naomi home where he gave her the remaining beatings. She cried helplessly. Her mother supported the beatings. They had thought Naomi left unannounced. The evening after Baba Femi's outburst, Naomi sat alone in the corner of the dimly lit room, her face hidden in her hands. The pain of her father's cruelty gnawed at her heart. His anger had torn through her like a storm, and she had no idea where she was supposed to go from here. All she wanted to do was disappear, to vanish from the world that had become so harsh, so unforgiving. Her body ached from the brutal beating, but the physical pain paled in comparison to the emotional devastation. Naomi had hoped her mother would comfort her, tell her that everything would be okay, but her mother's words felt like salt in an open wound. As she sat there, her mother entered the room quietly, her expression somber. Mrs. Femi sat beside Naomi, her face clouded with concern. She tenderly stroked Naomi's hair, though her touch felt distant, as though she were unsure of what to say. "Oh, Naomi," Mrs. Femi whispered softly, her voice trembling with worry. "I never imagined things would get this bad. Why did you leave the house without telling anyone?" "Your father," he was beside himself. Naomi looked up, her swollen eyes filled with tears. She wanted to scream, to tell her mother that she didn't leave because she wanted to, but because her father's oppressive rules had driven her away. But all she could do was lower her gaze, too afraid to speak the truth. She was scared of her mother's reaction. "I'm sorry, Mama," Naomi whispered, her voice breaking. I just couldn't stay there anymore." Mrs. Femi sighed heavily. "Next time, my child, you need to inform your father or me. You know how he gets. We all worry about you." Naomi winced at the words. How could her mother not understand? If only she knew the truth, Naomi thought, if only she knew why she had fled in the first place, she wouldn't be speaking like this. The weight of the unsaid words hung heavily in the room. Her mother gave her a lingering look, then stood up and left quietly, leaving Naomi alone with her pain and guilt. Naomi sank back into the corner, feeling more abandoned than ever. She had always felt the sting of Baba Femi's harshness, but never like this. His wrath had always been directed at others, but now it was all focused on her. And it hurt in ways she never thought possible. The next day, Ada had tried everything to reach Naomi. She hadn't heard from her friend since the night Baba Femi had stormed her house, and the silence was deafening. She knew she couldn't wait any longer. She needed to see Naomi, to make sure she was all right. But the moment Ada stepped into Naomi's house, her heart sank. Baba Femi was standing there, his eyes as cold as ever. Without a word, he walked up to Ada and grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the door. His grip was so tight that Ada winced in pain. "Don't you dare ever come near my daughter again," Baba Femi warned, his voice like ice. "You have no place in her life anymore. You've poisoned her mind, and I will make sure she knows who her true family is." "Don't test me, Ada." Ada stood frozen, the words slicing through her like a blade. She had no idea what to say. Her heart broke for Naomi, but her fear of Baba Femi's wrath kept her silent. She wanted to scream, to run to Naomi's side and tell her that she hadn't meant to hurt her. But Baba Femi's warning hung in the air, suffocating her. She could never see Naomi again, not if she wanted to avoid his cruelty. Days passed in a blur of sorrow and loneliness for both girls. Naomi stayed holed up in her room, not daring to leave. She had become a prisoner in her own home, torn between the love she still had for Ada and the fear of her father. The sun was shining brightly over Agba village as the highly anticipated coronation ceremony took place. The entire village was out in full force, preparing to celebrate the crowning of a new leader, and the air was thick with excitement. Naomi knew she had to attend. It was an important family event, and her mother had pressured her relentlessly. But inside, Naomi was anything but celebratory. Her body still ached from the beating her father, Baba Femi, had given her just days earlier. Her mind was consumed with thoughts of escape, of Ada, and of the uncertainty that seemed to hang over her life like a dark cloud. Despite her bruised spirit, Naomi managed to put on a brave face and accompany her mother to the event. She had no choice. The coronation, after all, was a significant occasion for her father's family, and her presence was expected. As Naomi stepped into the large gathering, she was greeted by villagers wearing their finest attire, their faces bright with joy, but Naomi's eyes remained distant. Her heart was heavy, each beat reminding her of her father's rage and the tangled web of fear and control he had woven around her. The ceremony itself was grand. The new leader was introduced with all the customary fanfare, music played, drums beat rhythmically, and dancers filled the village square, their graceful movements showcasing the cultural pride of Agba. Naomi tried her best to join in the celebration, but it felt like a hollow experience. She forced a smile when she was introduced to relatives, feeling their eyes on her, but every word they spoke felt muffled in her ears. Her mother noticed her silence and squeezed her hand, but Naomi barely felt it. She was somewhere else, lost in thought, wondering how long she would have to live under Baba Femi's oppressive control. After the coronation festivities had wound down, and most of the villagers had dispersed, there was a quiet tension in the air. Naomi retreated to her room, feeling drained from the forced socializing. But she couldn't rest for long. Her father's figure lingered in her mind, his anger, his touch, his demands. And she knew she had to keep her wits about her. Later that evening, as she sat quietly in her room, Naomi's gaze flickered to the front gate. Her room faced the entrance of their home, and she had been keeping watch for any signs of movement. It was then that she saw Baba Io walking toward the house, his gait slow and deliberate. Naomi's heart skipped a beat. She quickly dashed out of her room and hid behind the kitchen wall, crouching low to avoid detection. She had done this many times before, listening to snippets of conversations she wasn't meant to hear, but this time it felt different. This time, something in the air was heavier, more dangerous. Under the shade of the mango tree, Baba Femi and Baba Io began to speak. Naomi's breath caught in her throat as she strained to hear every word. "I missed out on Naomi the last time," Baba Femi's voice rumbled, filled with frustration. Naomi's heart skipped a beat. She knew exactly what he meant. He had been making out with her, using his position as her father to manipulate her. But the last time, when she had escaped to Ada's house, he hadn't been able to carry out his plans. The thought of it sent a chill down Naomi's spine. Baba Io's response was calm, almost dismissive. "You can't let that happen again. You can't afford to miss out on the next one, Baba Femi. You've got to take control." Naomi's blood ran cold as the realization hit her. The next one meant her father's plans for her, his twisted idea of ownership. She felt trapped in the web of their conversation. What did Baba Io mean by taking control? And why did Baba Femi speak so casually about their manipulations, as if they were entitled to her? She swallowed hard, her throat tight with fear. She knew what was happening, even if she didn't fully understand it. There was more to their relationship than she had ever been told. And now, her father was determined not to let her slip away again. Naomi's mind raced as she heard the men talking, each word digging into her like a knife. She wanted to scream, to run away, but she was paralyzed. Her father's control over her felt suffocating, and this conversation only made it worse. She had to get out, but she didn't know how. Baba Femi's anger had always been unpredictable, but after this conversation with Baba Io, Naomi feared what might come next. Her thoughts swirled in confusion, and she could barely process the reality of the situation. All she knew was that her father was not going to let her go. Not easily. That night, Naomi lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. She had overheard Baba Io's warning, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was coming. What would happen the next time her father made a move on her? How could she stop him? Her thoughts turned to Ada. Ada had always been her confidant, her closest friend. Naomi needed to speak to her, to figure out what they could do. She couldn't stay in this house any longer, and she couldn't trust her father to let her live a life of her own. But at the same time, she knew they had to be careful. Baba Femi was unpredictable, and any wrong move could cost them everything. She grabbed a piece of paper and wrote a letter to Ada, explaining what she had overheard and how she felt trapped. The letter was her only way to communicate her fear and plan her next steps without putting herself in further danger. Ada. I overheard Baba Femi and Baba Io talking. Baba Femi was angry that he missed out on me the last time, and Baba Io warned him not to let it happen again. I don't know what that means, but it sounds bad. I don't know what they're planning, but I can't stay here any longer. I need you to help me figure out what to do next. Please, Ada. I'm scared. Naomi carefully folded the letter and placed it in her drawer, knowing she had to send it to Ada soon. But for now, all she could do was wait. Days passed in silence. Naomi didn't leave her room, and her father said nothing about the conversation she had overheard. The quiet was more unnerving than the anger. Baba Femi had retreated into his own world, but Naomi knew it wouldn't be long before he would make another move. She stayed hidden in her room, her mind racing with thoughts of escape, of what the next time would bring. She couldn't stop thinking about the conversation between Baba Femi and Baba Io. What did it all mean? What was the real danger she was facing? Ada's next letter came soon after, and Naomi read it with desperate eyes. Naomi, I'm scared for you. We need to be careful. We can't make a move until we know what's happening with Baba Femi and Baba Io. Don't worry, I'm with you. But we have to stay in the shadows for now. Be careful. It was a small comfort, but Naomi knew Ada was right. They had to wait. The storm was coming, and they needed to be ready.